A staggering 55% inflation in just 1 year. A country's currency losing almost 90% of its total purchasing power, and governments that, without any official announcement, are quietly and silently eroding and devaluing their people's hard-earned money. These aren't scenarios from an apocalyptic movie. Every single one of these cases is absolutely real. They have actually occurred in the past, and some of them are still ongoing. The question is, before disaster strikes completely, is it truly possible for us to determine if a country is spiraling toward a state of total national bankruptcy or not? In this video, we're going to break down exactly that together. What are the signs that show a government is reaching the end of the line, and what decisions lead countries to financial collapse? When bankruptcy actually occurs, what exactly happens to the hard-earned salaries of everyday people, their personal savings, and their overall purchasing power? And why do some governments prefer not to pay their debts, while others struggle until the very last moment to pay them back, no matter what the cost? But the most important part of this video isn't something you hear in the news. The most important question is, when your country is heading toward bankruptcy, what exactly should you do with your money so it doesn't get wiped out? This part is truly vital. It's an important and rarely discussed reality, one that many people only come to truly understand after they've lost absolutely everything. If you stay with me until the very end of this video, I'll reveal this secret to you clearly, precisely, and without any unnecessary lying. Imagine waking up on a perfectly ordinary morning and checking your bank account. Everything is just as it should be, giving you a sense of security. Maybe it's $10,000, $20,000, or whatever amount makes you feel at ease. You grab your morning cup of coffee, switch on the news, and suddenly you see a very unsettling headline. The national government has officially gone bankrupt, or in other words, it has defaulted. But what does default actually mean? Essentially, this means the government makes a formal and official announcement stating it cannot or will not repay a specific portion of its debts on time. Now, here is a very crucial and important point. Governments are not like regular people such as us, who, when we go bankrupt, have to sell our homes or have the bank seize our personal assets. Governments, on the other hand, have the ability to print more money up to a certain point. But doing this directly leads to an increase in inflation. So, when a government defaults, people's money doesn't just disappear all of a sudden. Instead, its value decreases, the country's economic structure collapses, and people's purchasing power plummets. The amount of money in your account stays the same, but with that same amount, you can no longer buy what you used to. Now let's look at some real-life examples. First example, Argentina. Throughout its history, Argentina has defaulted several times, and one of the biggest defaults happened in December 2001. At that time, the government was unable to pay its massive foreign debt of over $90 billion. So, what was the result? The economy plunged into a severe crisis. The value of the national currency collapsed, and it took years of complex debt operations and negotiations with creditors for the country to reach a relative balance. Second example, Sri Lanka. In April 2022, this country announced it would stop paying its foreign debts. For the very first time in its entire history, it officially defaulted, because it no longer possessed enough foreign currency reserves left to meet its obligations. What happened next? The value of the rupee went into a sudden free fall. Inflation soared rapidly. Fuel and food became increasingly scarce, and people's daily lives plunged into a real and painful crisis. Our third example is Greece. Following the financial crisis of 2010, the Greek government was forced to significantly raise taxes and drastically cut government spending in order to pay back its debts to international creditors. This policy is commonly referred to as austerity. The result? The country's economy shrank by about 26%, unemployment surged to record levels, and Greece's young generation faced one of the highest youth unemployment rates in all of Europe. These stark examples show that default isn't just an economic term, it's a devastating social earthquake. It's an earthquake that doesn't steal people's money, but slowly and quietly devours its entire intrinsic value. Now let's examine a fundamental question together. Why do governments even accumulate so much debt in the first place? The answer to this question isn't simple at all, but there are several important and very real reasons behind it. Governments usually borrow money from banks, other governments, financial institutions, or both domestic and foreign investors. They do this to build major infrastructure like roads, bridges, and power plants, or to invest in vital sectors such as education, healthcare, or even to deal with economic crises. When the economy is experiencing steady natural growth, and government revenues are consistently high, these national debts are manageable and can even be quite beneficial because they directly contribute to long-term development. But if unexpected events occur, things can quickly get complicated. For example, when an economic recession begins, government revenue from taxes decreases, while at the same time, social expenses like unemployment insurance and government aid increase. This consequently leads to a situation where the government is unable to pay its debts in a timely and efficient manner. Another important reason is that the money borrowed was not utilized in a proper or particularly effective way. For instance, it has been spent on projects that were largely ineffective or simply lost through corruption and the massive waste of resources. When resource management is weak, or when widespread corruption exists, debts, instead of being a primary driver of growth, turn into a heavy and overwhelming burden on the economy and, much like a cancerous tumor, gradually bring it to its knees. Another reason is that some countries choose to accumulate their debts in major foreign currencies, like the US dollar or the euro. Now, if the value of the national currency drops, the cost of repaying that same debt in foreign currency suddenly multiplies, making it extremely difficult for the government to pay it back. This is called an increase in the foreign interest rate. When debt goes past a critical and unsustainable threshold, and the government can no longer pay it back, the primary and most severe economic burden usually falls directly on the everyday people. To make up for the lack of money, the government might start the process of printing vast amounts of additional currency, which significantly increases inflation. If this money printing gets out of control, the result can be devastating hyperinflation. This means that prices rise at a dizzying speed and money essentially loses its purchasing power and becomes virtually worthless. In this situation, people still have money in their bank accounts, but they are only allowed to withdraw up to a certain limit, or their money loses its value completely in a very short period of time. One of the most famous examples is Venezuela's hyperinflation. At the height of the economic crisis there, according to various reports, the inflation rate in 2018 reportedly reached millions of percent. It was estimated to be around 130%, and the value of the bolivar plummeted dramatically, losing almost all of its worth. Now, when a country or a government defaults on its debt, the important question that arises is, what do foreign countries and international investors actually do? In the past, war and direct military threats were among the primary tools that creditors used to collect the debts owed to them. For example, during the period of the Venezuelan crisis from 1902 to 1903, the nations of Great Britain, Germany, and Italy imposed a naval blockade on Venezuela due to significant overdue payments. They seized several ships, and there were even some instances where limited military conflict actually occurred. This historical example illustrates that before the formation of modern international laws, force and violence actually were among the primary tools creditors used. But today, things are fundamentally different. The United Nations and the framework of international law now work to strictly prevent the use of military force as a way to resolve debt disputes. Consequently, sovereign countries can no longer easily or arbitrarily seize each other's assets as they frequently did in the past. However, it is important to note that diplomatic residences, embassies, and various military assets are still generally immune and cannot be seized under international law. Another consequence of default is the collapse of a country's creditworthiness. Just like private companies, countries also have a credit rating. And when they default on their obligations, this rating usually drops significantly. The end result is that access to new loans becomes much more difficult and far more expensive for them. What this means is that if previously they could borrow at lower interest rates, now they have to accept higher rates for investors to be willing to take on the added financial risk. This essentially means that even if a country manages to avoid repaying its debts in the short term, in the long run, borrowing becomes significantly more difficult and much more costly for that country. Furthermore, its reputation as a trustworthy and reliable borrower is severely damaged. In addition to these effects, defaulting on debt causes investors to lose confidence in the country's financial stability, prompting them to withdraw their capital from that country, which can further harm its economy. The outflow of capital puts intense pressure on domestic financial markets, causing a devaluation of the national currency and increasing overall economic volatility. In short, countries generally prefer to pay their debts, or at the very least, to enter into new agreements. This is because if they do not do this, it is not just the creditor's money that is at risk. The country's credibility, its trade relations, its ability to attract foreign investment, and its access to future financial resources will all suffer serious damage. But how do countries actually get out of default? When a country defaults, it needs two absolutely essential things to get back on its feet and restore stability. First, this involves improving the country's economic situation, which means identifying and then fixing the specific problems that caused the default. This includes reforming the tax system, better controlling government spending, reducing corruption, increasing economic productivity, and restoring trust in the financial system. Without these reforms, any money that comes into the country will just be wasted again. Second, settling or restructuring the debt with creditors means that the debtor country comes to a formal agreement with those who lent it money on the specific details of how the debt will be repaid. This process is typically carried out through debt restructuring. This means either the repayment period is extended or the interest rate is reduced, or part of the principal debt is written off, which is called a haircut. For example, after the financial crisis, Greece in 2012 was forced to reach an agreement with its creditors, and about 53% of the principal of its private sector debts was forgiven so that the country could breathe again. Sometimes creditors also provide new loans so that the country can restart its economy and at the same time pay off part of its old debts. These agreements are usually made directly between the debtor country and its creditors, but several important institutions play a key role. First, there is the Paris Club, which is an informal group of major developed countries that coordinates the sustainable restructuring of the debts of poorer countries. Second, the International Monetary Fund, which uses the financial resources of its member countries to provide loans to nations in crisis so they can rebuild and revitalize their economies. Third, China, which today is one of the largest and most influential creditors of poor countries and often acts independently of the IMF. And finally, the World Bank, which is similar to the IMF, but its primary focus is more on development and providing long-term loans to poor countries. The important point here is that these aids are not unconditional. Almost always they come with conditions such as austerity measures, reducing government spending, increasing taxes, structural reforms, and sometimes the privatization of assets. And unfortunately, the main burden of these policies usually falls on the people. Like in Greece, which during its debt negotiations experienced unemployment, wage cuts, and widespread street protests all at the same time. Another bitter reality is that these institutions are not charities. Their main goal is to get their money back, even if some of these policies are beneficial in the long run. The indebted country often has to accept agreements that are not necessarily in the absolute best interest of its people. In the case of Greece, an overwhelmingly large majority of the bailout packages was used to repay debts to banks and European creditors, while merely a tiny fraction of the funds went directly into the actual domestic economy and the daily lives of the people. However, getting out of default is by no means impossible. For example, after the devastation of 2 world wars and the burden of heavy debts, Germany was able to become one of the world's most powerful economies again. This was largely thanks to the London Agreement in 1953, which forgave about 50% of its debts. So, while there is certainly a path to recovery, it remains a very difficult one. It necessitates a combination of smart investment, low corruption, the implementation of genuine structural reforms, and full cooperation from creditors. And ultimately, which country actually manages to overcome default is not just an economic issue. It is a deeply political matter tied to the overarching power and the strategic interests of the creditors. Overall, in my opinion, when a country approaches bankruptcy, it's the people who suffer the most, because in situations like this, it's always the ordinary people who get hurt first. It's a bitter reality, but unfortunately, that's how the modern economic system works. Now, I'd like to hear your opinion. Why do you think national governments end up going completely bankrupt most often? Share your unique thoughts and perspectives in the comments section down below. In short, it doesn't matter how much money you have in your bank account. What really matters is the actual value of what you have. Especially, you should keep in mind that sometimes a country's bankruptcy doesn't happen with a sudden collapse, but rather shows itself through gradual inflation and the steadily decreasing value of people's hard-earned savings. So, what exactly is the golden solution for all of us? First, diversify your investments. Real estate, stocks, commodities, and even digital currencies like Bitcoin, because these can't just be printed out. Their value is significantly less under government control. Second, invest internationally. If possible, try to put a portion of your money or assets in countries that have more stable economies. This way, if your own country's currency loses value, you will still have some foreign financial backing. And most importantly, always maintain awareness and careful planning. You need to know how your country's economy is actually doing, how much debt it currently has, and what the ongoing inflation trend looks like. This information effectively helps you make much better decisions to protect your money. To put it in much simpler terms for everyone to understand, if you want to know exactly how you can protect your money when your country is heading toward bankruptcy, the best strategy you can implement is not to put all your eggs in one single basket.